It's roughly 100,000 years ago. Someone you would recognize as fully human just died, and the people around them didn't walk away. Most people assume ancient humans treated death the way animals do, practically without ceremony. They didn't. Most people, if pressed, would guess that deliberate burial started somewhere around the time of the pyramids. Maybe ancient Egypt, maybe the Greeks, somewhere in the neighborhood of civilization. That assumption is off by roughly 95,000 years. Kafze Cave, in what is now northern Israel just outside Nazareth, contains at least 15 individuals, adults and children, buried intentionally, dated to somewhere between 100,000 and 120,000 years ago. These are not bodies that fell into a pit and got covered by sediment. They were placed, arranged. The positions are deliberate, the graves are dug, and the bodies are not alone. Here is where it gets specific. The sediment surrounding the bones at Kafze was saturated with ochre, a red iron oxide pigment ground from certain stones. It has no nutritional value. You cannot eat it. It does not make a tool sharper or a fire warmer. The only reason you bring ochre to a burial is because it means something to you. 84 ochre artifacts were recovered from those layers. Someone was processing this pigment in quantity, deliberately, in a space where the dead were being laid to rest. That is not accident. That is preparation. Then there is Kafza Burial 11, a child, roughly 12 or 13 years old, placed in a specially carved rock recess, body flexed, with the antlers of a fallow deer laid deliberately across the chest and hands. Antlers on a child, in a grave. You do not place antlers on a dead child unless the act carries weight, unless the community around that grave shared some understanding of what the gesture was for, what it communicated, and to whom. Nearby School Cave adds another layer. A man buried with a wild boar jaw placed in his hands, not discarded near him, not fallen there accidentally, placed in his hands. Why would you do that? The only answer that makes sense is that you believed he was going somewhere, and you wanted him equipped for it. That is not a practical thought. That is a metaphysical one, 100,000 years ago. Now raise the stakes considerably. Move south to Rising Star Cave in South Africa, where the evidence gets genuinely uncomfortable. The hominin found there, Homo naledi, had a brain roughly 1/3 the size of yours. It was not Homo sapiens. It was not our species at all. And yet researchers have found evidence suggesting that Homo naledi was carrying its dead deep into this cave system, through narrow shafts, down 30 meters, into chambers that show no sign of habitation. Reaching it required carrying bodies deep into the cave, climbing and crawling through darkness. To be clear, the scientific debate around Homo naledi is not settled. A peer-reviewed critique has cast doubt on the burial claims and called for deeper investigation into the science behind the findings. But that debate itself tells you something important. The evidence is serious enough that researchers are fighting about it rather than dismissing it outright. Here is the uncomfortable truth version of what we are looking at. If the Homo naledi evidence holds even partially, then the impulse to treat the dead with deliberate care predates our own species. It predates language as we understand it. Homo naledi stood just over 4 feet tall, with a brain just 1/3 the size of our own, and something in that creature apparently drove it to haul its dead into the dark, rather than leave them where they fell. Intentional burial is not a product of civilization. It is not something that emerged when humans had enough food and leisure time to start philosophizing about death. The archaeological record, from Kafzi's ochre-stained children to the contested depths of Rising Star, keeps pushing the origin point further back, into a time when the very definition of human gets blurry. The behavior appears to be older than the species that perfected it, which leaves the real question sitting right in front of you. Okay, they buried their dead, but what did those rituals actually look like? Because the graves at Kafzi don't just tell us that these people cared, they hint at something far stranger about what these people believed. The boar jaw placed in that man's hands at school, do you think that was about belief in an afterlife, or just a way for the living to cope with loss? Drop your answer in the comments below. Either way, what those graves reveal about what these people actually believed gets even stranger from here. The Kafse burials told us they cared. The ochre, the antlers on the child, the boar jaw placed deliberately in a dead man's hands, those told us something was being communicated. What Sung here, Russia, tells us, roughly 34,000 years ago, is what that communication actually cost. 2 children, aged 10 and 12, were buried head-to-head in a long, slender grave in what is now the Russian plains east of Moscow. Their grave was filled with more than 10,000 mammoth ivory beads, 20 armbands, 300 pierced fox teeth, 16 ivory mammoth spears, deer antlers, and carved artwork. Each one of those beads was hand-carved from mammoth ivory. Researchers estimate that carving a single bead took roughly 45 minutes. 10,000 beads. Do the math. That is the equivalent of nearly 7,000 hours of skilled labor, carved, one bead at a time, by a community that also needed to hunt, build shelter, and stay alive through a Russian winter. They were spending the caloric equivalent of weeks of hunting on decorating the graves of 2 children. In a world where every calorie was a survival decision, this community chose ceremony over survival margin. That is not practicality. That is devotion. Analysis of the skeletons shows that both children suffered from physical abnormalities. One had short and bowed thigh bones. The other was likely bedridden and had trouble eating. These were not the community's strongest hunters. They were not its future providers. The finding shows that you didn't have to be a big adult male hunter to get an extravagant burial in this world. These people were burying their most vulnerable members with the most extraordinary care. That tells you something about what they valued, and it sounds recognizable because it should. To bury someone with 10,000 carved beads, with spears and antlers and fox teeth, you have to believe those things matter to the person you are burying. You have to hold a concept of somewhere they are going. That requires abstract thinking about death, time, and an existence that continues beyond the body. That is not instinct. That is theology, worked out around a fire 34,000 years ago by people who had never heard the word. Shanidar Cave in what is now Iraqi Kurdistan holds one of the most debated graves in all of paleontology. In the 1950s and 1960s, archaeologist Ralph Selecki proposed the flower burial theory, the idea that Neanderthals had laid one of their own on a bed of flowers, for reasons ranging from medicinal purposes to expressions of affection and respect. It had a transformative impact on debates about the abilities and humanness of Neanderthals, who had previously been characterized in many texts as considerably less than human. For decades, the flower burial was the emotional centerpiece of the argument that Neanderthals grieved. Then, the reanalysis arrived. Recent research published in the Journal of Archaeological Science cast doubt on the hypothesis, suggesting that the pollen found in the grave sites might not be evidence of a floral grave gift at all, but rather the work of bees that nested in the cave sediment and carried pollen in naturally. The flowers, it seems, may not have been placed there by grieving hands, but that revision actually makes the picture more interesting, not less. Shanidar 4 remains of notable importance in being part of a tight cluster of remarkably complete and deliberately emplaced Neanderthal skeletal remains. The flowers are contested. The deliberate placement of the bodies is not. The evidence is serious enough that researchers are still fighting about it rather than dismissing it, which means the real picture is probably more complex, not simpler. Your brain was not built for grief as a philosophical exercise. The regions that activate during mourning, including the anterior cingulate cortex, the same circuits involved in processing physical pain, are ancient structures. Grief hurts because evolution made social loss feel like bodily damage, because for a small band of hunter-gatherers, losing a member was a genuine survival threat. The ritual was the community's way of metabolizing that threat together. The gathering, The objects, the ceremony, those were not decoration, they were the mechanism. The next time you stand at a graveside or feel the specific, weighted silence of losing someone, you are not doing something civilized. You are not doing something modern. You are doing something at least 100,000 years old, practiced by people who had no word for what they were doing, only the overwhelming need to do it. The impulse to gather, to mark the moment, to place something meaningful with the dead, that was not invented by any culture or religion. It was already there, running in the architecture of the human brain, long before your species had a name for itself. The oldest thing about you might be the way you mourn. Subscribe if this changed how you see your own grief, and we'll examine what ancient humans actually believed about the afterlife next.